Awesome. All right. There wasn't a countdown. We just go straight in. Hey, everybody. My name is Chris Kopstock. I get to serve as a pastor down here in Georgia. I'm here with my buddy. I always point, it's the other way. My buddy Samora. And I'm excited. I'm going to let you meet him in just a moment. But I want to always open up by sharing the heart behind what we do here week in and week out on Back Porch Conversations. I was struggling through just some things that had happened, especially here in 2020 and the difficulties. But even beyond this, right, we're talking about a bigger conversation. But really, this year has felt different. It's felt like the conversations need to be had, that people are open to hearing. And one passage that really stuck out to me that's really kind of been wrecking my heart over these last few months is this passage in Mark. So I want to read it for you again if you are just tuning in for the first time. This is the heartbeat behind why we do what we do here. It says, soon the house where Jesus was staying was so packed with visitors that there was no more room, even outside the door. And while he was preaching God's word to them, I love this, 4 men arrived carrying a paralyzed man on a mat. And I love this because just think about this for a second. These 4 men had never been paralyzed before. They had no idea what it was like to live a life of a paralyzed man. And yet they recognized his hurt and his pain and his suffering and wanted to walk with him through it. I think it's so pivotal. And it says this, they couldn't bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, so they dug a hole through the roof above his head and they lowered the man on his mat right down in front of Jesus. And I see this for us today. Even though they didn't understand his struggle or his pain, they walked alongside of him. When he couldn't walk at all, they carried him. And I think it's important for us to recognize that there are stories in our lives, there are experiences in our lives that are different than everybody else's. And if we're not willing to learn and to figure those stories and struggles out of other people, then we're always going to kind of walk in a single-sided point of view in life. And it's not fair because there are multiple points of view that we have to be able to learn from. And so we always get the question, why back porch, right? Why do we bring people to our back porch? Well, I think it's important to note that you would take anybody and stick them on your front porch. But it's pretty rare that you would bring somebody to your back porch because you had to bring them through your whole house. You let them see your junk and your messy house, and then you bring them out here. But it's often on the back porch that we're able to have some of the most intimate conversations. It's those conversations that are about life and are really, I think, some of the most pivotal, at least for me, life-changing moments because you're being real and genuine. You kind of shed the fakeness and you allow the true self to be revealed. And that's what we get to do here. We get to bring people on week in and week out, and we get to let them share their stories on my back porch of what their life has been like, because it's important for us to gain perspective. It's important for us to recognize that at the end of the day, other people's lives have been different than ours. And so I believe firmly this is a conversation worth having. I believe that us having this conversation matters because it allows everybody else to kind of learn from each other. It allows us to kind of come together and to see that my life is going to be different than my buddy Samora's life and his experiences and what God's done in his life and how he's had to grow. And so that's where we get to learn today. So I want to introduce to you, to my right, maybe your left. I really don't know how this works online. My buddy, this way, my buddy Samora. And Samora and I met about a year ago on a mission trip in South Africa. And so as you can tell, this is not live officially today because Samora is in South Africa, and it would be 3 a.m. his time if we filmed this at 9 o'clock at night. So we decided to film it at 9 o'clock in the morning instead to maintain that 9 a.m. feel. So that way Samora could be awake and cognitive for this talk. But Samora lives in Pretoria, South Africa, and I'm going to let him kind of share a little bit more about what God is doing in his life there. So Samora, thank you for hopping on this afternoon in South Africa this morning here. Introduce yourself and tell them about what you're doing in your life right now.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Christopher. I'm so glad to be a part of it, dude. Christopher has been a good friend. But so, yeah, I live in, as Chris has already said, I live in Pretoria, South Africa right now, originally from South Africa as well. And so for the last 2 years, more specifically, I have just had the honor of serving with an organization called Abbott's Pride, which Chris is very familiar with. That's how they were connected to South Africa and came on a mission trip here. And so for the past few years, that's what I've been doing. I've been serving as a missions group leader, serving as a social media manager, doing sometimes an after school mentor. So we work with a lot of churches, specifically in under-resourced areas, especially just outside of the Gauteng area. And so Gauteng is the province that Pretoria is in. So we work with a lot of churches in poor and more like under-resourced areas of the country. And we just walk alongside churches. We find out what God has placed in their hearts and how we can be of assistance to that. And specifically, we focus on churches that have a heart for children, vulnerable children. And so we work with a lot of churches that either that started an early childhood development center or have some sort of after-school program that they're trying to run or something that they have running. And we find ways to resource that. So we provide food, support in many other ways to kids who are vulnerable in those communities. And so, yeah, I've had the pleasure of doing that. And most recently, I've started to take on seminary as well. So I am also a full-time student on top of that at the Baptist Theological College of Southern Africa. Yeah, so that's what that keeps me busy on the day-to-day.
That's an understatement. Samora, you and a lot of your team, you have spent a lot of time on my back porch as we meet pretty consistent. We try to meet every week.
Yeah, we do.
You always come out. You've gotten to see my back porch and the donkeys and the horses to my side here. But but I want to really dig in for a few minutes this afternoon, this evening, to talk about your experience, because you have not only lived in South Africa, which is a very big piece, and we're going to talk about it here in just a minute, but you've also lived here in Virginia for a few years as well. And so, before we dig into all of that and how you got from place to place, tell me a little bit for you, like when did you recognize that racism was real for you? Like when did you see that you weren't like what the norm expected you to be like, or when people started treating you differently? When was that for you? When did you see that differently?
That's such an interesting question. I was thinking about it, and I think for me, an even better question for me is when did I not know that racism existed? Wow. I think for a long time I've had that, and I think a lot of that is because of my father. So when I was young, my dad was involved very much in anti-apartheid politics in South Africa. And so from a young age, I was very much exposed to the condition of our country. And so I knew that this was what it was going to be like. But it wasn't personal for me. It was sort of this theoretical thing that, hey, Black people are being treated differently from white people and all of that stuff. But it wasn't real for me until I think I was 7 years old. And we took a trip down to the Western Cape, which is a beautiful part of South Africa. And we were visiting my aunt who lives in a town called Mossel Bay in that side. And along that trip, I think we were just, cruising. My dad, my sister, and I were in the car. And it's such an early memory of the stark comparison of race that I'd ever seen. We walked into this restaurant, and everyone who was in the restaurant who was enjoying the dining experience was not like me. Everyone was white, but everyone who was in the back, everyone was serving, doing all the serving, looked just like me. And so there was this idea that, like, I walked in and my family were excited. We're taking a short, rest from our trip, and we get to sit down, and I look around and I'm like, wait a minute. Why are all the people who are doing all the work the ones that look like me, have the color of my skin, but everyone who's like enjoying the experience doesn't look like me? And so it was in that moment that something sort of clicked in me, and I came to see it more often as I would grow up, that there is definitely something in like that has like been internalized by society, that I am somewhat inferior or different. And so I could get into the politics of why that setup would be like that, but I think that was the very first time where I was able to comprehend it myself, and not just listen to people talk about it, but that was the first time I was able to see it and be like, hey, this gotta there's got to be something more to this, right? Like, there's got to be a reason why we are the only Black people actually sitting in the restaurant and eating in it, and everyone else who looks like me is doing all the manual labor.
That's so crazy for you. And how old do you think you were then?
I think I was 9 or 10. I think, yeah. Because it was a long time ago, but it was my first trip to the Western Cape, and it was such a special trip with my dad because we drove all the way from East London all the way there. So it's like etched into my memory of that experience. So I think I was like 10 years old, and I was like, hey, listen, something is definitely like it was no longer this abstract type, because I would hear my dad, and my dad was very, woke, as the kids would say now, but he was well aware. He was very well aware of the state of our country, especially since he's had an active life in politics. And so he would always talk to us about the disparities between Black and white people. And so one thing I did appreciate about my dad is he never let that slide. He never let us fall into this lull about the realities of the world. Some might argue maybe I was too young to talk about racism, but I don't think anyone's too young to begin to learn a little bit about what's going on.
No,
and
not
so
at all.
yeah, and so that was when it really started to click to me. And I think, for the most part, I think, as I think it's James Baldwin who said, to be Black and even relatively conscious is to be, aware of things going on all the time, I think he said to be angry all the time. But I think it's just this awareness of all the outrage that happens against Black people all the time, or realizing the discrepancies. And so I think it's the same,
That's so good. Yeah, I know we are working through having those conversations with our 9-year-old at this point, and that's there's such innocence at 9 years old, and to see that broken, and recognizing that something is different, like that, it just doesn't seem fair.
Yeah.
So how did you end up in America then? So you were born and raised on the Eastern Cape of South Africa.
Yes, sir.
So how did you drop into Virginia, America somehow?
It's wild, man. I was born and raised in the Eastern Cape. I'm coming from a small town of Mthatha in the Eastern Cape. Not very big at all. Still largely rural, if you will. But the headmaster of my school was a pretty ambitious guy. And so in 2014, this was the start of my high school career. In 2014, he was at a conference in Chicago in the US, actually. And he was just I think he had just been wrestling in his heart about how do we expose these young kids to to develop a more global perspective of the world. Like, what can we do for them to begin to appreciate that the world is bigger than just this city in Mthatha that I come from, and that there's a wide variety and a breadth to the world and the depth that they cannot understand if this is the only thing they know. And so, obviously, I was in a Christian school, and so he was looking for Christian connections. And so, while he was in Chicago, he found out about this summer program that was being run by a private high school in Beaton, Illinois. It was called I can't remember what the summer program was called now. Anyway, but so he came back and he was like, "I'm so excited! I want you guys to be a part of the summer camp program that ran for like a month." So basically what was happening was it was a collection of students from all around the world, and so people of different ethnicities and from different places of the world would come together for the summer. At that time, they hosted it at Calvin College in Michigan. So they would come together. It would come together for like a month in the summer, and it was like a cultural immersion type of experience. And so we'd be immersed in each other's cultures, talk about what it would be like to go to an American high school and all of those things. And so it was this journey, dude. So when I went, there was a couple of my friends along with me that we all got to go on it together. When we went, we only had the intention of being like, hey, we're going to be here for the month, and then we're going to go back to South Africa, and we're just going to get into school and, continue with our lives. But while we were there, that July, August time, we started getting interest from some schools within the US that were like, hey, we want to diversify our student body and have these kids who go to these, some of them very elite, but not elite, but very, affluent private schools, have exposure to people from different places other than just like, this section of my school district. And so I eventually ended up at Norfolk Christian School because of that. So Norfolk Christian became my home. That it was so crazy because I left the States July, August, came back to South Africa. End of July, I left the States, came back to South Africa, and there was preparation of like, hey, August 22nd is the time that, if you wanted to really dive into it, this is what you would need to do. And so it was a very prayerful time, even leading up to the camp, if like, about what would happen. But everyone was like, hey, let's go for it. Maybe you'll spend a year, cultural exchange type thing and see how you like it. And I ended up graduating. So I went there and I ended up graduating from Norfolk Christian.
That's
yeah.
So good.
Yeah.
So what was your experience like? I mean, how did that shape? I mean, first of all, shout out to your teacher who saw the fact that you need to see the world as bigger.
Yeah.
And I think it's so pivotal. I know I was in student ministry for 15 years before we came to Georgia. And I always dreamed the same thing for our students. They would see it as the world as bigger than whatever small city they might be living in at that time. So what an incredible like visionary to be able to make that happen. But how did that change your worldview then? Like coming in to a brand new environment. I mean, what was your experience here? Was it different than what you saw? Was it more welcoming? Was it less welcoming? I mean, what was your experience coming from now? Not only are you different, are you a Black man living in America, but now you also have an accent to go with that. And you're trying to learn a whole new culture. So what was your experience like?
Oh man. Oh dude. It was overall it was a wonderful experience. But I think something I don't think people realize is that there is a compounding. Like I wasn't just like you said, I wasn't just Black now, but I was also African. And so that added like, so it was a merger of two pre-existing biases. So the first is, here's this big burly Black guy, but not only is he big and burly, but he's from a continent that Americans have seen in a certain light. And so there's all these stereotypes about well, not stereotypes because some of it is true, but everyone has been sort of based off of that scale. But there's all these stereotypes about how Africa is backwards and people are living in huts and wearing animal skin and being poor and illiterate. And so I was carrying both the stigma of coming from Africa and the tension of being Black in a place like this. And I think there's never been a time in my life that race came into such clarity for me, like the importance that race plays in how you are being treated and how you should do things. And so that Virginia is is a fairly conservative state, and it that comes with all of its own histories. And so when I first arrived, it was not the easiest time for sure. The first few months were really difficult because of the two things that I just mentioned. I remember a lot of people who I eventually really became good friends with. I was met with a whole lot more of not animosity, but a dismissive sort of function. I don't know how to put it, but this idea like that, it's just this poor guy from Africa and he's coming in,
it's like a sympathy towards you, like we should help this guy. Like look how broken that guy is.
Yeah, look at this guy from Africa. He obviously doesn't know anything about cars, and this modern way of life, and that wasn't so that wasn't helped by the fact that I was Black. I think I came into a high school that was predominantly white, and so a lot of the culture of the school was geared towards that. Not that was bad, because that was the audience that they were catering for, but it became hard to be. I think in instances where people aren't used to having a lot of Black people around, it becomes hard to easily be yourself in those areas. And so I think this is the crux of it, Chris. I think I have found that for a long time when I was living in the States, I found that it was easier for me to just, smooth out some parts of myself so that I wouldn't trample on anyone's feet, or people wouldn't be like, oh, what is with this African dude, or what is with this black guy, acting this way. And so I was living in a predominantly white community. I had a lot of white friends, and so that was my daily reality. And it was the most time in my life, because I grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood, in a black area of South Africa, where all I saw is black people in positions of power and all of these things. Wow. But then I step out in this world in my teens, and I walk into this world where, suddenly no one looks like me. Everyone who holds any authority is not the same color as I am. And so it became easier for me to begin to find ways of being the most disarming around white people, right? So wow. So there were things I wouldn't do. Like I would not, I wouldn't speak Xhosa. Xhosa is my home language. I wouldn't speak it when I was around white people, and I would my mom would call me, and I wouldn't want to answer, because then everyone here is gonna hear this language and be like, yo, dude, what are you doing? You gotta speak. What are you doing? Yeah, you gotta speak English. What are you doing? You're in
America now, man. Speak English.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's America. In America, we speak English, which is okay. But so I ended up softening a lot of parts of myself because of that. And I remember, I think it was, I can't remember now, but there was an incident like what we just experienced as well. That happened. I think it was in 2015. I'm trying to think of who it was, but there was a young black boy who was killed by the police in that year as well. And it had, it didn't have the same.
Was that Freddie Gray? Is that who you're talking about?
I think I want to say Freddie Gray. Yeah, I want to say Freddie Gray. It didn't have the same reverberation as it does now, but it happened. Mm-hmm. And I remember coming into I remember coming into school, or coming into some sort of activity where all my school friends were there a couple of days after that happened. And I was waiting for someone to when something big happens in your life and you're waiting for other people to recognize it, but no one ever does. And so I walked in and I was like, surely someone's gonna, I'm reeling from this event. Yeah. I just saw footage, which is another thing, but I won't get into it now. But I just saw this footage of this guy who looked like me die on a television. And so that was reverberating in my mind so much. It was rallying in my mind all the time. But it seemed like everyone else was around me was oblivious to that experience. Like it was not something that was on their radar at all. You know what I mean? And so it's not necessarily their fault that they wouldn't see things like this, because I think that the way our world has been shaped, it has made people who have privilege, white people, to have this sort of privilege where they can not be affected by things that I as a black person would have to pay attention to. And so I was paying attention. I was like, am I the only one who realizes that this is bad? Like, this is a terrible thing that's happening. But yeah, and so it was a lot of disarming. I learned how to be disarming to white people. I thought that I realized that was the only way I would be able to make it through.
I think that's what you just said. I think is a big thing that at least as a white guy, that I've never had to even think about. Like, I don't walk up to people and think, how do I make sure that they don't think differently about me? How do I kind of disarm their preconceived notions about me? How do I walk up and I talk to people, and the more conversations I have with people who aren't like me, the more I realize the work that goes into making sure that me and people like me don't think differently about them. And I've even heard some of my friends that I've talked to say, I want to make sure they think of me as one of the good ones.
The good ones, yeah.
And I just, my heart just breaks in that, because how foolish do we have to be able to look at somebody on the surface and say, I'm going to judge somebody based on how they look right now, that I'm going to see their appearance before I see their personality, that I'm going to see who they are based on what I can visualize rather than seeing their heart. And I just, like, it frustrates the crud out of me because we're on here and I don't know who's watching, and I got to use certain language, right? It frustrates me to no end that people for some reason believe that they have been given this authority to look at somebody created in the image of God and say, I think that you're less than me. And that you somehow have this perception as well because of what you've seen, that in order for people to accept you, you have to equally look a certain way.
Yeah.
That you have to act a certain way, that you have to be a certain way. And that to me is, I think, one of the top frustrating things that I've heard in all of these conversations that I've had.
Yeah.
And I just want us to get to a place as a society, as a world, where we don't have to walk in the room and somehow like shift who we are in order to be accepted by the people in that room.
Yeah.
I don't care what kind of room we're walking into.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're getting right into it, Chris. I think the biggest thing about minorities in America, but majority in South Africa, is also an interesting comparison. But the idea that you have to be aware of who you are all the time is a big burden to live with. You know what I mean? Like if I were to go into a room, I need to be aware of the way I'm speaking, especially when I'm back in South Africa. I've figured the same thing as well. Is this idea that I have to position myself to like get the best angle of me. You know what I mean? And so I cannot be fully who I am, because then you begin to revert back to being like, oh, you know, he's a typical black dude, or he's this or he's that. And so I found myself doing that. And one of the most hurtful things that was happening, especially when I was in the States, I heard this so much, and it used to drive me insane. But people would be like, oh, you're so, like, they would have this look of shock on their face, and they'd be like, oh, you're so eloquent, or you're so what, or you're so, and I was like, man, it felt like there was this, you know, this screening test, and then people would hear you speak, and then they would watch you, and they'd be like, oh, okay, we approve. You're so eloquent. You know, you're not like the rest of the people who look like you. And so, you know, somehow this is now making you better. And I figured that most of the time, what they meant wasn't a compliment to how well I was able to carry myself, but it was more so how much I was able to be like them in a way that was not threatening to them. And so the more I was able to fit into whatever, you know, category of person that they or behaviors that they thought were good, then that's when they were like, oh, okay, yeah, we can hang with you. You speak good English. You listen to American music. You do all these things, you know. And that was, you know. So it was there was a time in high school where I love rap music, and in high school I didn't listen to rap a lot. I was in high school at the time when rap music started to become incredibly popular. But the first I think the first year when I was in Norfolk Christian, I didn't I wasn't out there with it, because I didn't want to go into the stereotype of this, you know, black person who's all into rap music and listens to, you know, gangsters talk about doing gang stuff. Anyway, and so that was, you know, it's just one of the instances where I was like, you know, I can't be this part of myself, because, you know, I don't know what I don't want the ramifications or the stereotypical falling into this category of people, you know.
Yeah, that's such a hard truth, I think, for some of us to hear. But I think it's 100%, and I don't think it is 100% accurate, that it's a constant battle for many in this country and many around the world to fit into a mold of acceptance rather than being who God's created them to be. And all because of maybe what and here's what I've learned over time, Samora, if you want to be honest about it. They've built that mold off of television, off of movies, off of media, off of rap music, off of all these things. They said, well, this is what this culture is all about. And so and rather than actually sitting with people and having conversations and learning and growing, and because I think it's important to diversify the cultures that we're able to learn. I remember when we went to Africa, we told our students, some of them were a little bit more picky in their food choices. And they said, well, what if I don't like the food that they serve? I said, well, I don't care. That's what you have to eat. And imagine if I had said, well, it's okay, some more, we'll just make you a hamburger like you eat in America. We never said that, and we never gave them the option. We said you can have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That was like our give and take with them. But I enjoyed personally, because I'd never eaten South African food before, like learning that culture. I want us to be a society, like a culture loving society that can walk into a culture and say, I don't know anything about you. I don't know anything about your food. I don't know anything about who you are, but I want to learn. That's the whole point of what we're trying to get after. Like, how can we grow as a society to see that the differences that God has wrapped us in are what make us beautiful. Like, we are one body in Christ. And so you mentioned, sorry, go ahead. I don't want to cut you off.
I was going to say, I think that's a really good point. You bring up a really good point. But I think also on that same vein is, as we step into these different cultures of humility, we need to then re-examine the ways that we've been conditioned to believe about these cultures. And so if we're saying that media has conditioned us to think about Black people in a certain way, or that, you know, the way they've been depicted in movies has been conditioned us to think about them, or the way that even our parents have spoken about Black people has conditioned us to think in a certain way, then we need to begin to examine those pre-existing that machinery that is continuing to feed us this image of this is how Black people are supposed to look. And this is something we talked about a lot, Chris, when you were here, and I talk about it to everyone who comes to South Africa, especially on like a mission trip or something, is, hey, when you go home, I want you to begin to re-examine how you have been shaped to think about what Africa is. Because the biggest thing, people would come and say, man, hell, I didn't expect there to be an airport. Or I didn't expect, I didn't expect to see all these roads. And I'm like, you need to sit down and be like, and honestly, have a discussion with yourself about how you've been conditioned to think about certain things. Because I think if we try and move too much ahead of ourselves to be like, oh, let's embrace this, let's embrace one another, which is very good, and neglect that there is a reason, there's intentionality to how we have become the way that we are. And that there have been forces, there have been people who have intentionally shaped us to think about the world in the way that we do. If we don't do that, then we'll move forward, and then every so often we'll keep having explosions or these moments like this that we're having now, which we want to see less of, where people we don't find ourselves in positions of outrage in the same way, because we have been outraged, and then we've examined how all of the structures, all of our systems have made us think about things in this certain way,
I think if we could put a theme or a topic on this particular conversation that you and I are having, it's the idea of destructing the preconceived notions that people have.
Yes.
How can we destruct what you're bringing to the table? And the only way we do that is by having these kind of conversations, because we have to deconstruct all that we've been taught. Either, and some of those things like will be reaffirmed, right? Like, oh well, this is true. And some of those things are gonna be like, well, where did I even hear that from? How did I even learn that? But let's talk about that for just a second. I want to dig in to one last topic that you and I talked about talking through, which was kind of what shaped you there in Africa, which is kind of the apartheid. And you mentioned your father being a part of the anti-apartheid. So I want us to kind of, because I think it's important to learn culture and where you're coming from. And maybe we could have done this at the beginning, but who cares?
We're here now.
I think it's important because maybe we all kind of latch on to one Nelson Mandela quote, or, we even laughed kind of at the beginning of like watching Invictus or something along those lines. Like, now we know South African culture. And I didn't know how incredibly popular rugby is in South Africa. And you guys were like, legit like fans of it. And so let's talk about just for a minute, like how something can shape perspective, because the apartheid did just that for almost 40 something years, almost 50 years.
50 years,
they were building until really Nelson it was the one we know, but there were people before him that were fighting against it. So like super brief, short summary of kind of how that constructed what is now African culture and what you're fighting against even today, 30 years after apartheid ended.
Hey, that's a brilliant point, Chris. And I think apartheid, man, is I think is so helpful in understanding with this cultural moment, especially for me as a South African. I think I look at the States now and I have some emotional investment because I've lived there. I have friends that I love there. And when I look at the television screen, I see what's going on. The legacy of my own country sort of helps me build a perspective around it. But apartheid, in sort of the quickest way I can summarize it, was a very intentional institutional building of disenfranchising Black people and other minority groups in South Africa. And so what happens is the apartheid government, over the course of those 50 years, but even before that, when South Africa had been newly founded as a republic, began to institute laws that made it normal for Black people to be seen as less than. Wow. And so we one of the biggest perpetuators of this was the Land Act. And so something came along in the history of apartheid where the republic, or the government of the republic at the time, said, all right, this is what we're going to do. We are going to move Black people from wherever they're living right now, and we're going to clear them out, and we're going to make those areas exclusively white places, right? And so you move, 76% of the population is Black now in South Africa, and it was similar in terms of ratio at the time. But you move these people to only about, I think, 10% of the land. And so you take 76% of the population and you squash them in 10% of the land. You don't give them resources. You don't give them any ways to struggle, any way to maintain themselves in these places, and you take up the rest of the country. And so a lot of rich South African history was erased because of that. Places that were of significant cultural importance to South Africans were erased. Black people were disenfranchised. They didn't own land. They didn't own any resources of their own. And so they began to be in this. And so there's this idea that apartheid was a violent system, but violent for the fact that it was very intentional. Yeah. And so it's not how, and this is something I always try and drive this point across. It's not how we think about racism today. Today, I think a lot of times we think about racism as just hating a Black person, but we don't understand the structural vigor of institutionalized racism, where institutions are founded upon this idea that, hey, the Black people are less than because of this, right? Segregated in schools, segregated in facilities, segregated in places to live. There was a point in time where Black people needed a pass or some sort of permission to be able to go into cities and to go into towns. If Black people were found in towns, they would be brutally beaten by the police. They would be arrested. They would be killed. All of these things at the mercy of this apartheid government. And so there's a time when truly being Black was made through policy a thing that was acceptable. And so this is the point that I want to get to, is you raise a whole generation, right? 50 years, you raise a whole generation of people to think of Black people as not being human beings, as just ways of, as a means to an end, as people to clean our toilets, to, raise our kids, to do our gardens and do all of these things. And you raise a whole generation of people with that mindset. And then you expect it to be done away with just because they say, oh, now it's over and now we're done. You know what I mean? That's not how it works. And so, as you said, there were a lot of people, there was a big movement, an underground movement, because the ANC was banned after Nelson Mandela was sent to prison. The apartheid state banned all of these like anti-apartheid organizations, and so they were forced underground. And so there was a lot of work that was happening behind the scenes, where a lot of Black people were either writing about the Black experience in South Africa. There was this movement to try and preserve our dignity, to preserve our humanity, and not to get lost in how Black people were being described, how Black people were being treated. And so I think now we are 30 years removed. So in 1994 was sort of, the more popularized date when Nelson Mandela, who's one of the, more well-known figures of the anti-apartheid struggle, but there are a lot of people who were involved in that, other than just him. But in 1994, he not only was he released from prison, in 1993 he was released from prison, and we began to say, all right, we are abolishing apartheid as it stands. Now we're going to move into a democratic South Africa. But the thing is, we never reckoned with what had happened the last 50 years. And I think that's where it always gets mixed up, is, hey, we have this baggage of history, and we're gonna move on and sweep it under the carpet and begin to, which goes back to this point I was talking about, that we need to be able to say, okay, now I recognize this is wrong, but then how do I then critique the ways that have led us here?
That's good.
Right? And a lot of times we don't do that. We say, oh, we don't have apartheid anymore, so there's nothing else that's going on.
It's all gone, right?
It's all gone now.
Fast. Yeah.
We have solved racism. Everyone is equal. Let's do this. But then we forget that Black people were moved away from land. They no longer own much of the land that they had. Upward mobility for Black people was just a non-existent thing. A lot of Black people were uneducated because of the state of our country. Black folks were only just being groomed for servitude, and so they were not being really educated. A lot of Black people who were being educated was only just a few people, and so we have all these problems. So we grow up in this no physical assets. No Black person was owning anything, and no Black people were quite well versed in how societies, like in modern society, because all of those things were being kept hidden from Black people, or when Black people were not being included in those circles. And so we come to 1994, and a large population of the country is Black, but and that same population does not really have a say or any power in how things are done. You know what I mean? And so we come to 1994, and a lot of people after post 1994 were like, all right, we're done with that. We don't want to talk about that anymore. We want to move on and pretend like everything's normal. And I hear this a lot from people, who are around my age, who would be like, well, that was our parents' generation. They did all of those things, and they were the ones that are to blame for that. But then we never reckon with the fact that now you've leaned into the privilege of your parents because of that. And now you want to say, oh, let's not talk about it as if the past has not informed how the present is, right? Yeah. And so it's a lot of that. A large majority of South Africa, and I say this with all the hope that the gospel provides for me, but a large majority of South Africa is still very much disenfranchised when it comes to Black people. I mean, you look at the communities that we work with. Now, people will debate like, oh, there is definitely government failure or whatever, but at the core of it is that there is a legacy of people of apartheid that still exists in our society, where Black people are still living in rural areas with no access to water, no access to roads. A lot of the communities, Chris, you've been to some of the communities, and a lot of them are built in such a way where because the apartheid government was trying to keep Black people sort of corralled in a space, are built in a way where there's only one road in and one road out. Yeah. Like the community has only one exit and there's like millions of people in this place. And so you even think about things such as that hey, the system was built specifically to make sure that you were never able to climb out of this area that you're in. And so now to climb out has to be a work of more than just Black people. Black people cannot be the only people fighting, saying, hey, we deserve to be treated as humans, or we deserve a stake in this country. But both races need to be coming to the table and being like, hey, for the well-being of us as a people, we need to figure this thing out. We need to talk about why we're here and how we can address that in a way that's beneficial. Because I believe that our own successes and our flourishing as a community is intertwined. I don't think that we can separate those two things. And so as more people come to the table and saying, okay, this is where we are, how do we then begin to navigate back,
Yeah, Samora, man, thank you for sharing that. I think it's important for us to understand where we've been before we can go forward, right? We have to know, and I think that's what we're kind of reckoning with even here in America, with this big battle for the Confederate flag and things like that. Like, it's important for us to recognize where we've come from so we can heal and find restoration and find a way forward, because if we're not willing to reckon with that, then we're only going to live in the hurt of the past. And so with that in mind, let's kind of end our time this morning or this afternoon, this evening, whatever it is now, with some ways for us to grow. I always like to end with giving people some options for resources. I always recommend if people are just getting started to hop into reading Be the Bridge, to hop into there's a Facebook group you can get into, and it's an important opportunity for you to just be silent for 3 months and learn and grow with people. So if you're here in America, that's a great opportunity for you. I think you can probably go anywhere and get in that on Facebook. I don't know how they do that, but I know it's here for sure.
I'm sure they can. You can get it. Yeah.
So Samora, what are some resources you would give people to kind of look at and read? What are some things that are shaping you?
Over the last couple of weeks, I've been doing just a light reading because I'm not because for me it's not the first time I'm getting exposed to the fact that racism exists. I've had a lot of time to sort of figure out what to read. But I think a good book that I read recently was by, incidentally, a white author, but his name is Ken Weitzma, and he writes this book. It's called The Myth of Equality. And so in it, he sort of pulls back the curtain on the ways that structurally racism has permeated even the church. And so how do we then respond, not just as like political activists, but as followers of Christ? Like, how do we then take a hard, serious look at where we are and where we need to be from that perspective? And so his book is titled The Myth of Equality. I think it's available on Amazon. It's a really great resource, something that I always refer back to just think about. And the second book I've read recently too is James Baldwin. James Baldwin is a fairly secular thinker, but he wrote a really profound series of essays, and it's titled Notes of a Native Son. And so in it, he looks at a lot of. It's very surprising when you read it because he captures a lot of the questions that we have right now around race and why, and most importantly, why you should care. Like, why should you care about what's going on in your country right now? Why should you care about racism, and especially in this particular moment? Why should you be making concerted efforts to think differently or to become a different person? Because at the end of the day, Chris, I think that as we try and dismantle structures that sort of allow racism to continue rolling, I think at the same time we need to dismantle structures within ourselves. But I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. I think those two things are in tandem. So as you work to dismantle existing structures in our world that have led to where we are now, we should be doing the same sort of spiritual work to dismantle structures within our own hearts that have led us to the space that we're at. And so, yeah, those are some of the resources those are the two books that I've read, that are top of my head that I've read recently, that I think people can dive into and sort of.
That's a good word, man. I'm gonna steal that quote. And I'll make it famous for you, man.
Oh, thank you, dude.
Dismantling. We can't just dismantle the structures around us, but we equally have to dismantle the structures within us, which is so good. Because we're all coming with our own baggage. Doesn't matter what color we are. We're all coming with our own baggage and views of the world, and we have to dismantle those. I love that. Well, listen, I so much appreciate you hopping on here. I know you've not felt well the last week. I'm glad to see you back up and fighting again. But man, I appreciate you and your work on Abba's Pride's work over there in South Africa. You guys are doing some really incredible things over there, and really making much of Jesus over there. And I just love it. I'm so thankful for you guys, and hope to come back and see you soon once all this Corona stuff
dude,
up for us.
We're looking forward to a time when we're not talking about the coronavirus.
That'd be fantastic.
Dude.
But I just want to remind everybody, remember, this is not something that's going to change overnight. Even as we're talking about, this is generations of systems and things that really for us, mentally, that we've got to break down. I love what you said there. We've got to dismantle things within us. This thing doesn't happen overnight. We don't just wake up tomorrow morning and everything is fixed and everybody's equal. I do 100% believe, as I wear this shirt from a buddy of mine that made it for me, that equality is greater than division. We have to fight for unity. We have to fight to be together, and we have to be able to sit in the room with people who aren't like us and to learn and to grow alongside of them. And really, the end of all this, we want to drive people towards learning, towards education, towards, learning different cultures, learning different structures, learning different ideas, and really hopefully shaping our worldview in a little bit of a broader spectrum than just whatever we've experienced.
That's right.
So these conversations are never about trying to change a certain structure or system. We're not in for that. We're in for our own life change, and I want us to be able to do that. So, Samora, thank you so much, man, for
thank you, Chris, dude,
for doing this. I
really appreciate being here.
And I will see you, I'm sure, on my back porch again soon, because
I think tomorrow, dude.
I think tomorrow morning,
actually. Yeah.
Well, when this films, it'll have been this morning.
Oh, that's true.
Because this will shoot at 9 o'clock at night tomorrow. So tonight, it's a weird thing, but it'll work out.
It'll work out. It's gonna be good.
But I love you, man. We're praying for you guys over there. Stay safe as well. Facebook world, YouTube, audio podcast, however you're listening. Thank you so much for hopping on. There are ways for you to follow us on all those avenues. So however you listen to content, we want to encourage you to do that, to listen, to learn, and to grow with us. So we will see you guys next week. I got my friend Donovan Earl coming on from Odessa, Texas. And then the week after that, we've got my buddy Charlie Butrago coming on from Venezuela. And it's going to be some really good conversations. So I can't wait. It's going to be it's popular right now, man. It's popular. All right, guys. Have a great evening. We'll see you guys soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Christopher.